Charles Spencer has genuinely been playing a remarkably careful game for close to 3 decades now. And here's the truly striking part about the whole thing. He's reportedly never once looked like he was actually playing one, not to anyone watching closely. Diana's own brother, the 9th Earl Spencer, the man who stood at the lectern in Westminster Abbey in September 1997 and, in front of the entire watching world, told the Windsors directly that the Spencer family would protect Harry and William from being consumed by duty and tradition.
Very early on the Wednesday morning, between the death and the funeral, and I just sat down and wrote it, and it took about an hour and a half. I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it, and I read it to her in there.
The congregation reportedly rose to its feet. The Queen, by most accounts, did not. That speech wasn't only grief. And what Spencer has apparently been doing ever since, quietly, patiently, with what looks like careful, plausible deniability at every turn, is genuinely the more interesting story here, because there's a pattern worth examining that doesn't get discussed enough. Spencer reportedly hasn't defended Meghan publicly. Not once, not by name, not on record. He defends Harry warmly and consistently. When it comes to Meghan, the silence has apparently been remarkably consistent too.
I was looking directly at William and Harry across her coffin as I delivered it, and that was very tough. In fact, in the final paragraph, I had run out of energy and almost out of oxygen.
Let's actually work through this whole story carefully and properly, because I genuinely think it's considerably more complicated than either a simple hero framing or an equally simple villain framing would ever fully allow for. Spencer isn't a difficult man to like, and that's worth acknowledging up front. Educated at Eton and Oxford, genuinely charming by most accounts, a successful history author, runs a podcast, opens Althorp to the public each summer where visitors can walk grounds where his sister is buried. He's spent nearly 30 years positioning himself as the warm alternative to what many perceive as the colder machinery of the royal institution, and by most measures that positioning has worked well.
All thoughts with them today.
Very much so, very much so. It's been a strange old time for you, hasn't it? It has been quite, you've been working away, you've been writing this, the White Ship, which I actually read in a one.
Royal commentators reportedly describe him in similar terms. Richard Eden, the Daily Mail's diary editor and one of Britain's more senior named royal correspondents, has reportedly characterized Spencer as something close to a father figure for Harry, someone the Sussexes have come to genuinely rely on. Think about what that specific role looks like in practice. Althorp reportedly opening its doors whenever Buckingham Palace's doors have closed. Spencer reportedly hosting Harry during the period around the Queen's funeral in 2022, during a separate family funeral trip in 2024, and again more recently, each time reportedly after palace accommodation either fell through or became disputed. Quiet hospitality, without apparent fanfare, exactly the kind of gesture that builds genuine trust over time. But here's the detail worth sitting with. Spencer has reportedly never defended Meghan by name. Not in an interview, not in a public statement, not on social media.
Prince Harry felt obliged to do it. But the impression I got from the Duke of Edinburgh was that it was Prince William who was reluctant. And Duke of Edinburgh simply said, we're doing this, and I think you'll regret it in years to come if you haven't done it. So this is what we're doing. We'll just do it.
The one notable exception. In November 2020, following news of Meghan's miscarriage, Spencer reportedly appeared on a UK morning show and offered warm condolences, describing the pain of any couple losing a child that way. That's reportedly the most direct public acknowledgement of Meghan as a person he's ever offered. Every other gesture, by most accounts, has been directed specifically at Harry. I don't think this necessarily proves anything sinister on its own. People express loyalty differently, and plenty of genuinely warm relationships with in-laws simply don't generate the same public commentary as relationships with blood relatives. But when a pattern holds this consistently across years and multiple controversies, where a single supportive word toward Meghan would have reportedly cost Spencer essentially nothing, it's at least worth noting as a genuine pattern rather than dismissing outright.
I had to prove that I was, not using illegal means to gain information. In fact, he slid into my DM.
It's genuinely worth acknowledging the more charitable version of events before going further, because it deserves real space here. People process grief in wildly different ways, and some people simply relate more naturally to certain family members than others, entirely apart from any calculated strategy. It's entirely possible Spencer's warmth toward Harry specifically, and his comparative reserve around Meghan reflects nothing more complicated than genuine personal chemistry, the kind that exists in countless ordinary families without anyone reading deeper meaning into it. Here's where things get considerably more complicated, though, and I genuinely think it's the most interesting part of this entire story we're covering tonight.
Did you feel the next day maybe bad about the Queen or the Duke of Edinburgh or even the Prince of Wales in some of what you said, the way it was reported at the time?
Well, that's the difference. What I said and what was reported.
In October 2025, Spencer sat for an interview on the Rosebud podcast, a relaxed setting, the kind where people occasionally say things more candidly than they might in a more formal context. Discussing being named guardian of Diana's sons in her will and what that designation actually meant given their father was alive, Spencer reportedly said something worth reading carefully. "I knew she'd left me as guardian of her sons. Obviously, the other parent being alive, that meant nothing. But it meant something to me. That sort of duty, I think. The other parent. Not King Charles. Not their father. The other parent." Phrasing that, intentionally or not, positions the actual King of England as something closer to a secondary figure in a story Spencer has apparently been narrating since 1997.
Oh, he's the evil brother. He's the nasty brother. He wouldn't even put these things aside for Diana. That is the narrative that I can quite clearly see being spun from the mainstream media.
Now hold that alongside something else. On January 22nd, 2025, the day Harry settled his lawsuit against Newsgroup newspapers, a settlement that reportedly included a formal apology referencing intrusion into Diana's private life, Spencer reportedly posted publicly, praising the courage it takes to fight opponents like that, and suggesting Diana would be proud, named, dated, entirely on the record. And when the Harry and Meghan Netflix documentary dropped in December 2022, one of the more talked about royal moments of that year, Spencer's reported response was a photograph of Althorp's winter countryside. Peaceful, quiet, no direct comment on the documentary or on Meghan at all. If Spencer's silence on Meghan is purely about discretion or privacy, it's worth asking why his praise for Harry so consistently lands publicly and on record by comparison. That's not necessarily proof of anything definitive, but it's a genuine asymmetry worth naming.
She has not mentioned there, what Paula Frolic has not mentioned, Angela, but what my reporting has been is that it's not just Harry and Meghan, it's also Archie and Lilibet, which is going to cause one hell of a war.
It's also worth being fair about the podcast comment specifically, since it's carrying a lot of weight in this analysis. People misspeak in casual, unscripted conversation constantly, and reaching for the most damning possible interpretation of a single offhand phrase risks reading calculated intent into something that might simply reflect how Spencer, in his own mind, has processed his relationship with his nephews over the years, without any deliberate positioning against Charles specifically intended. If this kind of detailed pattern tracking interests you, the like button genuinely helps this channel keep digging into stories exactly like this one, rather than just repeating the same headline everyone else runs with.
And of course, the press being the press, they spun, rather than let anyone look at that. Do you know the Sunday Telegraph actually took out the paragraph I said about the press when they covered it the next day? And I think the press whipped up the perceived anti-royal family bit.
There's a specific incident from mid-2025 that I think is genuinely worth walking through carefully in its own dedicated section, because it illustrates something important about how difficult it actually can be to pin down what Spencer's real private position on anything actually is, once you look closely at how the same event gets reported differently across different outlets. In June 2025, the Mail on Sunday reportedly ran a story under a named royal editor's byline, claiming Harry had approached Spencer about potentially using the Spencer surname for his children, reportedly amid frustration over delayed UK passports. That version reportedly had Spencer advising against the idea, calling it legally complicated, talking Harry out of it, casting Spencer as the measured, sensible voice in the room. The Guardian reportedly covered the same underlying story with a completely different framing, describing Spencer as enthusiastic and supportive rather than cautious, with a source reportedly quoting Harry directly describing his own frustration and his uncle's warm response to the idea. Then a separate outlet reportedly quoted a source calling the Mail's cautious framing simply inaccurate. 3 outlets. 3 genuinely different versions of what was apparently one private conversation. Even outlets that tend to lean more sympathetically toward the Sussexes reportedly couldn't agree on what actually happened in that room. There's no clean consensus here, just 3 competing accounts, and as far as available reporting shows, no clarification ever offered from Spencer's side. Worth being fair and naming the more mundane explanation directly. Private conversations get misremembered, retold secondhand, and colored by whoever's doing the retelling, entirely without any deliberate narrative management involved. That happens constantly with family conversations that later become public. It's genuinely possible nobody here was managing anything, and the discrepancy is simply what happens when 3 different journalists reconstruct one private moment from secondhand sources. That said, it's also fair to note that the version casting Spencer most favorably as the wise, cautious voice of reason happened to come from the outlet with, by reputation, closer ties to more establishment framing generally. Whether that's coincidence or something more deliberate isn't something we can definitively answer from outside that room. Now let's move to a considerably harder, considerably more emotionally weighted story to sit with, and I genuinely want to walk through this one carefully and with real sensitivity, because it involves genuine grief on multiple sides. After Diana's divorce in 1996, she reportedly wanted a specific, modest cottage located on the Althorp grounds themselves, her own family's ancestral land, somewhere that reportedly felt genuinely like a real home to her, rather than yet another grand ceremonial residence attached to her royal status. She reportedly asked her own brother directly. He reportedly said no, citing genuine security concerns at the time, and has stated publicly since that he genuinely believed it was the right decision, while separately acknowledging that she likely didn't see the situation the same way he did. Diana is now buried at Althorp, on a small private island situated within an ornamental lake on the estate, a specific location Spencer reportedly chose himself, one that genuinely does protect privacy while simultaneously placing her final resting place under exclusive, ongoing Spencer family control, with no outside access permitted. There's a genuine tension worth naming here, honestly, and I think it deserves real acknowledgement rather than glossing over. The same brother who reportedly declined to let her live on that specific piece of land during her actual life now, by most accounts, controls who can approach her grave in death. That's a genuinely uncomfortable juxtaposition, regardless of how you ultimately read Spencer's underlying motivations in either specific decision. Whether Spencer himself sees any contradiction in that sequence isn't something we can know for certain, but it's a detail worth sitting with regardless of intent. Now, let's move to something genuinely more institutional and legally grounded, because I think it actually matters quite a bit for understanding the real weight, or lack thereof, sitting behind Spencer's specific self-described role in all of this. Diana did name Spencer guardian of her sons in her will, a genuinely real, formally documented legal designation, written directly into her actual formal last will and testament, rather than something merely implied or verbally suggested in passing conversation. But under actual UK law, given that the children's own father remained alive throughout, that specific designation reportedly carries no enforceable legal weight whatsoever, none at all. Spencer reportedly confirmed all of this himself, directly in his own words, during that same podcast appearance we discussed earlier. No formal statute genuinely requires anything specific of him. No court of any kind oversees the actual role he's assumed. He's reportedly been operating under a genuinely self-appointed mandate for nearly 3 full decades now, accountable to essentially no one at all for exactly how he chooses to exercise that self-given role over time. That's genuinely not automatically damning on its own, and it's worth saying so plainly. People honor deeply felt, entirely informal commitments to deceased loved ones constantly, in all kinds of families, without ever needing legal enforcement mechanisms to make that specific commitment feel genuinely meaningful to the person keeping it. But it does genuinely mean that everything Spencer has apparently done in that specific capacity since her passing operates entirely on his own personal judgment alone, with no meaningful external check, oversight, or accountability mechanism attached to it at all, which is worth keeping in mind as we consider the scale of influence he's apparently had over the years. There's also a more recent, considerably more current flashpoint genuinely worth including in this whole picture too, because it demonstrates the exact same underlying pattern playing out in real time. When Meghan posted an Instagram reel in July 2026 showing Harry and the children walking toward Diana's grave at Althorp, reports suggested a genuinely strong reaction inside the palace. William reportedly upset, Charles reportedly disappointed. Spencer himself, according to available reporting, reportedly issued absolutely no public statement about it at all. His wife, meanwhile, reportedly posted a photograph taken from an entirely different location instead, drawing zero direct attention to the actual controversy unfolding. Same general pattern as before, essentially, according to this specific reading of events. Visible, quiet warmth toward the Sussexes generally, without ever directly and publicly engaging with the specific controversy itself, no matter how significant that controversy became within the family privately. Now let's actually go all the way back to that original 1997 eulogy specifically one more time, because I genuinely think it's the actual key to understanding everything that's reportedly followed across nearly 3 decades since. Spencer's actual, specific words that day, delivered directly from the lectern in Westminster Abbey with members of the royal family reportedly seated just feet away from where he stood. A pledge that the Spencer family, your blood family, in his phrasing, would continue raising Harry and William in a way that let their souls sing openly, rather than being simply absorbed by duty and tradition. That specific speech genuinely wasn't just an ordinary eulogy, by any reasonable reading of it now, decades later. Read plainly, it functioned as something closer to a public declaration, made at the most consequential possible moment, directly in front of the institution it was implicitly critiquing. Now, look honestly at what's reportedly followed in the nearly 3 full decades that have passed since that specific afternoon. Doors at Althorp opening consistently for Harry. On-record praise, consistently, for Harry specifically. Consistent silence on Meghan. A pattern that, when you genuinely take everything together as a whole rather than examining each piece in isolation, at bare minimum suggests Spencer has been operating with genuine, sustained consistency towards something specific over an extended period. Whether that's genuine, ongoing loyalty, a longer strategic project, or some combination the man himself might not fully separate in his own mind. I genuinely want to be careful here before drawing any firm conclusion, because none of what we've walked through necessarily makes Spencer's affection for Harry insincere in any way, and it certainly doesn't make his grief for Diana anything less than completely real and completely valid. Genuine loyalty and calculated positioning aren't always mutually exclusive. Sometimes they look identical from the outside, and sometimes the person living it doesn't fully distinguish between the two themselves. Worth genuinely noting too, purely in fairness to painting a complete and honest picture rather than a selectively flattering one, Spencer's own personal life has reportedly had considerable turbulence of its own over the years. His first marriage reportedly ended within just months amid documented infidelity, and he's been married a total of 4 times across his adult life. That's genuinely worth including here in an honest way, not really framed as some kind of disqualifying hypocrisy that undermines everything else he's done, but simply as part of the fuller picture of a genuinely complicated, multifaceted human being, rather than a simple, uncomplicated moral figure standing cleanly on either side of any dividing line. There's a comparison genuinely worth raising here carefully, and I want to handle it with real sensitivity, because it's instructive, even though it involves considerable tragedy touching multiple people across this whole story. Mohammed Al-Fayed similarly lost someone he loved to circumstances he blamed on the same institution, and spent years keeping that grievance publicly visible. The difference looking back is that Al-Fayed's specific claims eventually expanded into territory that lost public credibility over time. Spencer, by contrast, appears to have never significantly overreached across nearly 3 decades. Every move reportedly measured, every silence apparently deliberate. Where one man's grief over time became increasingly difficult for even sympathetic observers to defend publicly, the other's has apparently remained, by most current accounts at least, quietly untouchable in a way that's genuinely rare for anyone operating this consistently in public view for this long. This was arguably never simply about Harry specifically. It traces back to 1997, to a specific promise made publicly at the worst possible moment, and apparently kept since, on Spencer's own terms, at his own pace, in ways that consistently seem to land at moments that complicate things for the royal institution specifically. Genuinely, none of everything we've covered tonight actually makes Charles Spencer a villain in any straightforward sense. That would genuinely be too simple a read for a story this layered. He's genuinely a man who made an extraordinarily public, high-stakes promise back in 1997, delivered directly in front of the very institution he was addressing at his own sister's funeral, and has reportedly spent nearly 3 decades since finding quieter, more sustainable, more carefully calibrated ways to honor that specific promise over time. Whether that's genuine, pure loyalty, calculated leverage, or some uncomfortable combination, the man himself likely doesn't even fully separate in his own private thinking. That's genuinely not something any outside observer, however carefully they examine the available evidence, can actually answer with real confidence. And I think it's genuinely worth sitting with that unresolved uncertainty honestly, rather than forcing a clean, satisfying conclusion in either direction purely for the sake of a tidier story. What do you genuinely think? Does this entire pattern we've walked through tonight actually read to you as genuine, consistent, heartfelt loyalty to Harry specifically? Or does the Rosebud podcast comment, combined with the ongoing silence on Meghan across so many years, genuinely suggest something more deliberately calculated sitting quietly underneath all of it? And separately, on those 3 genuinely conflicting Spencer surname stories we walked through, does that specific discrepancy point toward actual deliberate narrative management happening somewhere behind the scenes? Or is it simply what naturally happens whenever multiple journalists independently try to reconstruct the same private, unwitnessed conversation from different secondhand sources with different levels of access? Let me know your genuinely honest take on all of this down in the comments below. I read every single response, and they genuinely help shape which stories we decide to dig into next. And if breakdowns like this one, the kind that actually try to hold competing explanations in view, honestly, rather than just committing to whichever version generates the most dramatic reaction, are genuinely what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe to Palace Insider so you don't miss the next one whenever it drops. A like genuinely helps too, more than you'd probably think for a channel still building its audience. It's honestly the easiest way to support this kind of work if tonight's story kept you watching all the way through to this exact point.